bone and sickle, bleeding saints and forest witches, the past unburied, the books unsealed, the old celebration returning.
Hello, and welcome to my study. Please come in and have a seat. All the books you're ending you are those used to research our show, and the individual to my right here, along with managing domestic duties, serves as our reader for any passages that will be directly quoted from these sources. Her name is Mrs. Carswell.
Hello.
So we're in our holiday season now. I know for Bone and Sickle listeners, the festive time begins before Halloween and then runs through that first week of December when the Krampus comes, and on into Christmas, into December, when we'll be presenting our annual Christmas ghost story.
And Thanksgiving's in there, too.
Yes, I only bring this up to say that sometimes things around here get a little hectic. There are stressors and issues that come up, but I'm happy to report that those noises we were hearing in the basement last month have stopped. Plumber said everything looks good down there, and I've had the clock picked up for a good cleaning and maintenance, so we hope to have that back and ticking off the minutes of the new year, maybe sooner.
Too bad the plumber didn't come until after the noises stopped.
Well, he said everything looked good.
He didn't find anything and didn't hear any noises, so it really doesn't tell you much.
I guess I'd rather just listen to him than to your bees. Mrs. Carswell's bees have been acting strange, and she seems to think they have the answer.
I never said that. I just pointed out that they were all over the Bilko doors because they sense something's going on in the basement.
Well, it stopped, and as far as that other thing...
I don't want to talk about it.
Look, I'm sorry I went into your room, but it was my Ouija board you had in there?
That's not it.
Right. And I thought we agreed you just had a sore throat.
I don't even remember it, so we don't need to talk about any horrible things that I said.
I'm just saying that a voice can come out kind of strange like that if there's inflammation or something.
Maybe it was vocal fry.
Well, maybe. I wouldn't say it sounded exactly like that.
It just feels like a bad dream. I've been having terrible dreams.
I'm sorry to hear that, but maybe it would be better to think about something else. We could do our Patreon thank yous as a distraction.
Thank you to our friends who listen.
I just keep having this one dream.
Thank you to our friends who listen to the show.
Sharing in our travels through tales of long ago.
Stories full of folklore.
Stories full of horror.
If you give us money, we will like you more.
And our heroes of the day are...
I'll read them, but...
I can do it. I have the list. We are very grateful to the following subscribers who've chipped in to make this show possible. They are Gleason Jameson, Kristen Kane, and Gabriel Suarez.
It just seems so real.
What?
The dream. I have to go into the basement.
Ah, yes, the basement.
I have to get a saw.
That's where they are.
And then I hear a voice that says, "Cut the cross," which means the cross-cut saw. There are two types of saws, right?
Well, yes, a cross-cut and a ripping saw that cuts along the grain, not across.
That'd be right then. I'm supposed to cut across your neck. I have to saw your head off, and then I have to bake it in the oven.
Oh. Well, you have been doing a lot of baking lately. Maybe...
I'm really sorry, but that is the dream.
Okay. So this one is episode 135.
I told you it was horrible.
It will be episode 135, Vlad the Impaler.
The year 1462. Constantinople had fallen. Muslim Turks swept into Europe with a vast superior force, striking at Romania, threatening all of Christendom.
Okay, that much, at least, is true in Coppola's 1992 version of Dracula, the first film connecting Bram Stoker's Count with Vlad the Impaler, though it's a bit free with the history. Sadly, there's no wife named Elisabetta, no misguided Romeo and Juliet suicide, no vengeful turning against God, and no weird red anatomical armor. But at least there's a nod to Vlad, whose birthday rolls around in November, on the 8th in 1431. And that and the Romanian connection between St. Andrew's Eve on the 29th and vampires made this seem a fitting topic for the month. Already during his lifetime, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Țepeș in Romanian, had become quite notorious in Europe, particularly so in German-speaking lands. This happened through the circulation of pamphlets, at least 13 versions over the years, which became a sort of 15th century equivalent of bestsellers or of lurid news tabloids. We'll be hearing from two of the oldest versions, both written around 1463 or shortly thereafter. Probably the earliest of the two, written anonymously and published in Vienna, was titled, in German, The History of Voivode Dracula. Voivode is a Slavic term used in this context to mean essentially prince. This narrative, published in Vienna, is sometimes called the St. Gallen manuscript, named for the Swiss city where it's preserved in archives. It probably was a source for the other German text, a rhymed narrative written by Michel Beheim, a poet associated with the court of the King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich III. Beheim worked within the Meistersinger tradition, meaning his poems were sung, and the text includes first-person references to a singer assuring his audience that these ghastly deeds are actually true, and, as he reminds the audience, they're very horrible. Beheim and the St. Gallen story reference specific monks and diplomats who witnessed the events, and key elements in these narratives are often corroborated by other histories and correspondences of the period, making room for a bit of poetic license, of course. About 3 decades later, in 1490, Vlad's story appeared also in northwestern Russia. We don't know its author, but the monk who copied it from a lost original mentions that his source was written in 1486. The Russian narrative includes several interesting episodes not mentioned in the German stories and provides a portrait of the voivode that's ever so slightly less evil. Beginning a few years before Vlad's death in 1476, pamphlets were being printed with woodcut depictions of the voivode, sometimes hand-tinted. It's not clear which came first, but also around this time, a portrait painting appeared, that iconic image which you've seen somewhere, with the long dark hair, wide mustache, and the cap adorned with jewels and pearls. It's sometimes called the Ambras portrait after its current location in Innsbruck's Ambras Castle, and is a copy of a lost original. It seems possible that Vlad actually set for this portrait, as it more or less agrees with the description of the voivode's appearance recorded by a papal legate, Niccolò Modrusa, during a visit.
He was not very tall, but very stocky and strong, with a cold and terrible appearance. A strong and aquiline nose, swollen nostrils, a thin and reddish face in which the very long eyelashes framed large, wide-open green eyes. The bushy black eyebrows made them appear threatening. His face and chin were shaven, but for a mustache. Swollen temples increased the bulk of his head. A bull's neck connected with his head, from which black curly locks hung on his wide-shouldered person.
Now, Vlad the Impaler is more properly called Vlad III. His father, Vlad II, was also known as Vlad Dracul. His son, using the Slavonic possessive form of that, would be Vlad Dracula. That's my stab at the Romanian, but in other words, Dracula would mean of Dracul or son of Vlad Dracul. There's confusion about the names Dracul and Dracula. They come from the membership of Vlad II and later his son in the Order of the Dragon. And because the Romanian word for dragon can also be used for devil, there's a tendency to interpret the name as Vlad the Devil or son of the devil for Dracula, all understandable given the Impaler's devilish reputation. But this derivation from dragon is Christian rather than devilish. It's from the dragon of St. George, the creature slain by the warrior saint who symbolizes the mission of the Order of the Dragon, one that was founded by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg in 1408. Their mission was to fight back incursions into European Christendom by the Muslim Turks. So nothing actually to do with a devilish dragon cult. So, what about these impalements? While they're mentioned with almost tedious frequency in these texts, it's hardly a chore for the sadistic voivode. Beheim describes a scene frequently illustrated in the pamphlets.
He sat down to eat in the midst of the slaughter. He ate his meal at the table, filled with glee. It was his bliss to witness the dripping blood of the dying. He had the custom of washing his hands in blood when his dinner table was brought to him. Whenever he dined, if he wished for merry and ever new amusements, miserable victims were paraded by, who, when tortured, screamed loudly. This was his joy and delight.
Among the tortures,
some had teeth bashed out, some had fingers lopped off, and others lost their limbs. This faithless fellow had ears, mouths, and noses cut off, and hair ripped away to the scalp. Some he had hung on a pole, others had their cheeks burned through. If a person had so long suffered such pain and torture and could no longer cry out, then Dracula pulled out his saber and lopped off his head or choked him straight away. Whether these be women, men, or children, he did this often, whenever he sought diversion, joy, or fun.
One of the drawbacks to picnicking in a field of skewered corpses is that the older ones will begin to decay. All three accounts describe a particular interaction involving the smell. Here's the Russian version.
A servant of his who set food before him could not bear the stench of this, and stopped up his nose and bent his head to the side. Dracula asked him, "Why are you doing this?" And he answered, "My lord, I cannot bear this stench." So Dracula ordered that he be impaled on a stake on the spot, saying, "You will live high here, so the stench will not reach you."
Quite the problem solver, this Dracula. And now, a little geography for context. I'm pretty sure listeners know that Transylvania was a region of modern Romania, but it should be noted that this country didn't exist until 1859. Since the 10th century, these lands belonged in part to Hungary, and by the 15th century, the Ottoman Turks exercised increasing control. During Dracula's time, Romania consisted of three regions: Transylvania on the west, Moldavia in the east, and Wallachia below them both in the south. Transylvania and Moldavia were more securely under Hungarian control, while Wallachia was slightly more independent and served as a buffer to Ottoman-ruled Bulgaria across the Danube. Dracula was Transylvanian only inasmuch as he was born within the region, in the town of Sighisoara, but his family left for Wallachia when he was 4, and it was there that he and his father ruled. He was voivode of Wallachia. Transylvania was relatively prosperous, thriving under the influence of German immigrants who'd established it as a sort of colony. While they weren't exclusively from the German region known as Saxony, these immigrants were locally known as Saxons. The region's commercial assets were something bitterly envied by Voivode Dracula, who was repeatedly frustrated in efforts to draw them into Wallachia. Transylvanians, in fact, became a major target of his cruelties. Gory details on all that coming shortly. And so that leaves us to ask, what about that castle in Transylvania, Bram Castle, the one tirelessly promoted by the Romanian Tourist Authority as his home? It's a beautiful place and fun for all the Draxploitation, but the Wallachian lord would have hardly been welcome there. Instead, his royal court was in Târgoviște in Wallachia. That site is substantially less photogenic, being now almost completely in ruins, so Bram Castle makes for a nice alternative, if historically inaccurate. Now, a bit more about Vlad II to set the stage for the Impaler's story. Ever since 1417, the Ottomans exerted control over Wallachia, imposing a tributary tax, basically protection money that guaranteed the Turks would leave the Wallachians alone. It was a burden Dracula's father assumed when he became prince. Ironically, it was during his rule of Wallachia as a sort of Turkish vassal that Vlad II was initiated into the anti-Ottoman Order of the Dragon. He apparently was not a very dedicated or reliable dragonist, as he agreed in 1437 to support Sultan Murad II in his campaign against the Hungarians. And then, to make things more confusing, by 1441 he was in talks with János Hunyadi, the leader of Hungary's armies, about supporting them against the Ottomans. Being independent from Hungary and technically independent from the Ottomans, as long as the tribute was paid, would for centuries force Wallachian rulers to engage in risky balancing acts like this. If all this gives you sort of judgy feelings about Vlad Dracul not being true to his word, wait till you hear about what he did with his sons. In 1442, learning of the voivode's failure to support the Turkish army against the Hungarians, the angered Sultan ordered him to his court in Edirne, Turkey, along with his sons Radu and Dracula. Vlad Dracul is briefly imprisoned and punished with increased Wallachian tributes, but in 1443 is released. There's a catch, however. He has to leave his sons behind as insurance. The brothers spend the next 4 years in Turkish exile. Dracula would have been 12 at the beginning and would never again see his father, who was killed in combat a year before his release. This detention was not an imprisonment exactly, but an instance of a Turkish custom known as devşirme, the so-called child levy or blood tax. The children in these cases were exclusively those of important families in the Christian Balkans, held not only to ensure parental compliance, but to encourage Ottoman acculturation. They were educated in the palace school, studying Turkish, Persian, probably Latin and the Quran. They could also be used as palace slaves. It's sometimes speculated that Dracula's exposure to the Sultanate inculcated in him a taste for autocracy, or even his taste in wardrobe, as his bejeweled and embroidered dress in that portrait painting suggests a certain Turkish influence. The assimilation of his brother Radu, however, was more complete. He not only chose to stay behind when Dracula was released, but fought for the Sultan in the siege of Constantinople. He may also have converted to Islam. And more dramatically still, it was Radu who would later replace Dracula on the Wallachian throne in a sort of Shakespearean act of sibling betrayal. According to the Byzantine historian Laonikos Halkokondylis, whose source was Mahmud Pasha, Grand Vizier to the Sultan, Radu also served the potentate in another way. In his 1465 volume, The Histories, he writes that the Sultan
was in love with the boy and invited him for conversation and then for drinks to his bedchamber. The boy did not expect to suffer such a thing from the Sultan, and when he saw the Sultan approaching him with that intention, he fought him off and refused to consent to intercourse with him. The Sultan kissed the unwilling boy, who drew a dagger and struck the Sultan on his thigh. He then fled in whatever direction he could find.
Shortly afterwards, however, he complies and
became the Sultan's lover.
While Dracula and Radu are detained in Turkey, their father returned to the Wallachian throne, attempting to negotiate a neutral path between Ottoman and Hungarian conflicts, which culminated in the disastrous Crusade of Varna, during which the Hungarians, aided by the Polish and Burgundian forces, were roundly defeated. At one point, Dracul captures Hunyadi as he flees the Turks, then decides to release the Hungarian leader, a favor not returned several years later when Hunyadi decides to invade Wallachia. As the voivode flees Togrovista, he is killed by Hunyadi's men in a marsh. Dracula's older brother Mircea is also captured, but fares even worse. He is blinded by red-hot pokers and buried alive. Hunyadi then places Vladislav II on the Wallachian throne, a member of a rival clan with ties to the Hungarian court, the Danesti. But in 1448, shortly after Dracula has been released by the Turks, Vladislav leaves Wallachia, Hunyadi, for a further campaign against the Ottomans, and Dracula, backed by his former captive, briefly seizes the throne, only to be displaced by the returning Vladislav 2 months later. Very short reign. After several years in exile among the Ottomans and Moldavians, Dracula takes advantage of disputes that have arisen between Vladislav and Hunyadi and gathers troops to retake his throne. By 1456, Hunyadi has died, Vladislav's been assassinated by his own men, and Vlad Dracula is again the Prince of Wallachia. His second reign gets serious in 1459 with a round of impalings. On Easter Sunday, no less. His first target, the murderers of his father and brother. These were the boyars of Togrovista, along with their supporters and families. The boyars were the land-owning aristocracy outside the capital, a pesky class that tends to stir up resistance against an autocrat. Laonikos Halkokondylis, in his The Histories, reports that
he killed them all by impalement, then in their sons, wives, and servants, so that this one man caused more murder than any other about whom we have been able to learn. In order to solidify his hold on power, they say that in a short time he killed 20,000 men, women, and children.
Other sources allege that the more robust boyars were spared and marched 200 kilometers to the ruins of Poenari Castle and forced to rebuild it. This site is sometimes identified as Dracula's real castle, and though it was restored under his rule, the edifice seems to have been more of a fortress, strategically guarding the Idris River. Nonetheless, the difficult-to-access ruins have been decorated with a few mannequins impaled on stakes, and nearby is a Castle Dracula hotel with themed displays. As soon as he took the throne, Vlad set his sights on Transylvania. His agenda included issues around the Transylvanian Wallachian goods and currency exchanges, but also on the acquisition of commercial products and producers, particularly the swords and swordsmiths for which the Saxon Transylvanians were famous. While he promised in a letter of 1458 to protect the Transylvanians against the Ottomans, a hint of his autocratic instincts slips out.
When a man or prince is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to. But when he is weak, a stronger one will come and do what he wants to him.
Dracula seems to have been touchiest about Transylvanians in the city of Brasov, those who supported the House of Doneshti and gave sanctuary to a pretender to the throne, Dan III. According to Beheim, Dracula had him captured, stood by as he said his final prayers, and then...
The wicked and cunning one had a grave dug, ordering that Don be led to the hole, and then decapitated.
Next, Dracula captured 400 or more young Transylvanian men, probably skilled tradesmen, like swordsmiths, and brought them all to Wallachia, hoping to see them learn the language and take up residence. But shortly after they'd arrived, the voivode's trademark capriciousness took over. Beheim writes,
This vile tyrant, he had them all burned to death, stating, I cannot tolerate it, should they gain knowledge here and come to know my homeland.
Beheim mentions massacres and impalings in the Transylvanian towns of Amlash and Fogorash, but Vlad's greatest wrath seems to have expressed itself in Brasov. After decapitating Dan III, he
burned down St. Bartholomew's Church, taking all, its monstrance, chalice, and vestments for the Holy Mass with him. He seized everything, whatever he had been able to find.
Naturally, there were impalings, wouldn't be Vlad without them, but he also got more creative with the Saxons, according to Beheim, who writes,
He had some of his nobles beheaded, and he used their heads as bait for crayfish. Then he invited their friends to his house and offered them this same crayfish to eat, saying, You're eating now your friends' heads. Then he had them impaled. Some people he had ground up on a grindstone, and he ordered that some captives be stripped naked and placed nude in the earth and buried up to their navels. Next, he commanded that sharp arrows be shot at them. Then many of them all together were roasted and flayed. He ordered, made to measure, a very large cauldron which could be heated. It had 2 handles. On top was a lid made of planks. The lid on the cauldron was covered with vents, so that a person might stick his head through them. Then the monster had a large fire made under it, had the pot heated, had water poured into it, and had these persons boiled therein.
Beheim generously details out further atrocities.
Some people he ordered wounded, then had their wounds rubbed with salt. Others he had roasted in hot lard. Some were roasted, burned through, some were broiled, some skinned, and still others were hanged. Some were ground on a sharpening wheel, still others got lowered into the latrines. Some nude were hanged by the hair, others he directed to be suspended on iron chains. Those who had been struck in their eyes, noses, and mouths, and in their private places, he commanded to be hanged. He also had stones thrown at them until they perished. For some people, he commanded that others bore out their eyes and nails be shoved through their ears. Dogs, too, were put to use. If incited to attack humans, they would immediately bite them to death. Some were fastened to wild steeds that were allowed to race through the streets. Others were hitched to wagons and let roll downhill. There was nothing to prevent their necks from being broken. Some he hurled from catapults, putting others in cannons from which he then ordered that they be shot. He seized suckling children a half a year old or more, whom the mothers pressed to their breast, arms clasped lovingly around their children. With their little arms, the children clung fast to their mothers. He had them impaled, too. Mothers with children in diapers.
We can skip ahead a bit. That's too gruesome, actually. And I rarely say that.
Skip to where?
Then he cut off.
Is that really better?
Somewhat. We'll finish it there.
Then he cut off their breasts, which were roasted too, and their husbands were forced to eat them. Then he had them impaled swiftly.
Always impaled. Impaling is just a baseline. As evidenced in the intro to the Coppola film, it's the Turks, not Transylvanians, who are best remembered as Vlad's foes. After their victory over the Hungarian army at the Battle of Kosovo in 1448, followed by their victory against all of Christendom at Constantinople in 1453, the expansion of their empire seemed unstoppable. However, throughout this period, Vlad III, like his father, had continued tribute payments to the Sultan, sometimes even traveling in person to Turkey to offer up the gold. In 1459, Pope Pius II called for a crusade to check Ottoman expansion, especially leaning on Hungary for all this. At the time, Matthias Corvinus, who just replaced Hunyadi as leader, was a bit preoccupied with his own conflicts with Friedrich III of Germany, but Vlad Dracula endorsed the Pope's call, or at least in spirit. While he did not send troops against the Turks, he did stop paying the Sultan's tribute. Something else probably sparking this defiance: the Sultan had added to the annual tax a requirement that Wallachia also annually send young boys to be trained as janissaries, an experience more or less identical to what Vlad had endured as a boy. The St. Gallen manuscript, like Beheim's poem and the Russian narrative, all describe a subterfuge by which Vlad draws the Sultan's emissaries into a vengeful trap.
Dracula immediately had the Turkish emperor's people informed that he wanted to bring the tribute personally to the emperor. The Turkish emperor's people rejoiced. Thus, he had the Turkish emperor's people come to him in large groups, one after the other, and all the courtiers rode forth to receive them. And he had all the Turkish emperor's people killed. Also, he had the region called Bulgaria completely burned, and he had some there nailed by their hair. And in all, there were 25,000 killed, as well as those he had burned. Ambassadors from Hermannstadt saw in Wallachia the dead, and those impaled like a large forest, aside from those he had roasted, boiled, and flayed.
Mehmet II was a bit perturbed by all this, naturally, and sent a massive army into Wallachia, second only to that with which he'd conquered Constantinople. 80,000 men against the 10 or 15,000 commanded by Vlad. And most of the Wallachians were recently drafted farmers, and alongside these were youths as young as 12. Corvinus promised Dracula reinforcements from Hungary, but they never arrived. The goal of Mehmet's invasion was not merely to remove Vlad from the throne, but to install his brother Radu in his place. Outmanned as he was, Vlad's men resorted to guerrilla warfare, hiding in the mountains and occasionally emerging for hit-and-run cavalry attacks. They also dug pit traps and poisoned wells along the way to Torgovishta. Streams were diverted to create impassable marshes. Towns were evacuated. Farm animals and grazing herds were relocated to deprive the advancing army of any possible food source. One source claims that Wallachians suffering from the plague or leprosy were left behind to spread disease among the Turks. The St. Gallen text also describes a curious stratagem, a sort of 15th century psyop involving a group of gypsies and Vlad who
dressed them all in cowhides, and the same with their horses. And now when they came upon one another, that is, the gypsies and the Turks' horses took fright and fled on account of the commotion, and the gypsies followed. Thus the Turks couldn't control their horses, and they fled to a river with the gypsies following, and they all drowned.
I'd like to see that scene in the next Dracula movie. Despite all these impediments, Mehmet's men continued to make their way north, eventually encamping not far from the capital city, Torgovishta. Knowing the risks of a daylight face-off, Vlad hoped instead to simply assassinate the Sultan by night. Some sources have Vlad himself conducting reconnaissance disguised as a Turk, slipping into the sleeping camp, trying to locate the ruler's tent. On the night of June 17th, the full Wallachian army attacked the camp by torchlight in an assault Romanians know as the Night Battle. It's the subject of a much circulated 1866 painting, Battle with Torches, by Romanian painter Theodor Arman, and Victor Hugo wrote a poem about it in 1859, in the first of his 3-volume Legend of the Ages. The June 17th anniversary was even commemorated for some years with a theatrical reenactment staged outside the ruins of Torgovishta Castle.
Doamnelor și domnilor, Vlad Voivode Dracula, Bogdan Gianu!
While there were heavy casualties on both sides, and as celebrated as the night battle might have been in Romanian history, the Sultan himself survived, and the next day his troops continued their march into the capital city, only to find it mostly evacuated. Not regarding this as a worthwhile engagement, Mehmet has his men leave the city, only to encounter something else outside its walls, something awful, described by the Greek historian Chalcondyles.
They beheld their own men who had been impaled. The Sultan's army entered into the area of the impalements, which was almost 2 miles long and 3/4 of a mile wide. There were large stakes there on which it was said about 20,000 men, women, and children had been spitted. Quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. The Sultan was seized with amazement and said that it was not possible to deprive of his country a man who had done such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and its people. And he said that a man who had done such things was worth much. The rest of the Turks were dumbfounded when they saw the multitude of men on the stakes. There were infants, too, affixed to their mothers on the stakes, and the birds had made their nests in their entrails.
While Mehmet may have been impressed by the atrocities, it did not stop the Sultan from installing on the Wallachian throne someone a bit less dramatic, shall we say. That very year, Radu was made prince, and Vlad was again forced into exile by his own people who supported the change and maybe just wanted a ruler who was a little less stakey. Despite Vlad having alerted Matthias Corvinus that he would be joining Hungary against the Ottomans, and despite the voivode's gory demonstrations of this stated purpose, Corvinus actually supported the installation of Radu. Justifying this change of allegiance, Corvinus produced several letters, now believed to be forged, in which Vlad and the Sultan conspire against Hungary. In the autumn of 1462, Hungarian troops captured Vlad and transported him to Visegrad Castle near Pest, where he was imprisoned for the next 14 years. Gabriele Rangone, the Bishop of Eger and advisor to Corvinus, in a 1476 letter to Pope Sixtus IV, describes the imprisoned Vlad as obstinately clinging to his evil ways, writing that he
would trap mice, cut them into pieces, and stick them on bits of wood as he had done with the men he had impaled.
The Russian text adds to this particular myth. It describes the imprisoned prince also decapitating and plucking the feathers from birds. While Vlad is imprisoned, Wallachian rule is unstable, juggled among several voivodes, each only briefly on the throne. Vlad eventually returns for a final reign lasting roughly a year, during which he fights the Ottomans in Serbia and is killed in battle. Details on this are unclear, though our Russian text claims that during battle, Dracula
was separated from his troops. The soldier who was closest to him mistook him for a Turk and struck him with a spear. And having seen that he was being killed by his own men, Dracula killed 5 of his murderers with his sword, and they pierced him with many spears, and thus he was killed.
What became of the Wallachian lord's body is a matter of scholarly debate, convoluted histories, and folklore, a bit much for our present context, but something I'll save for our Patreon pages. But if Vlad was in fact killed by the Ottomans, it's unlikely that body and head would have remained together, as heads of important adversaries who'd been killed were usually removed on the battlefield as trophies, but also for confirmation of the kill. It's a practice that continued up until World War I, actually. In fact, in southern Serbia, in the town of Niš, you can see what's left of a skull tower created by the Ottomans in 1809. It's built from the heads of 952 Serbian rebels after an unsuccessful uprising. Now, when it comes to the 15th century narratives I've shared, I'm sure you've asked yourself how much of this could really be true. I don't personally believe Vlad impaled mice in prison, but I do believe he impaled quite a number of enemies, if not 20,000 at a time. And some of the other more exotic punishments are a little hard to swallow, but it seems unquestionable that Vlad was a cruel and probably sadistic ruler, if perhaps a bit less so against the standards of his day. The reason for these exaggerations isn't hard to guess. Beheim was singing his songs to entertain an audience, and as such was covered by poetic license that might allow him to pump up the gory details a bit, and the same sort of thing would help to sell pamphlets. But there's another dimension. Beheim and the St. Gallen author also seem to be targeting German speakers with a bit of propaganda, using exaggerated horrors to stir up support for fellow Germans in Transylvania. The same sort of tales circulating through the Hungarian Empire could also help justify turning on a former ally, on Vlad, if not the Wallachians, and keeping him imprisoned for 14 years. I mentioned before that the Russian tales describe a slightly more ambivalent figure. The cruelties are still there, but alongside these are other stories portraying Vlad more as a ruler enforcing the common good, albeit with a particularly severe touch. In a couple of these, we see thieves kept at bay by the threat to the voivode's particular brand of justice, One describes a prominent well known for its sweet and cooling waters, and how
Dracula set a goblet, magnificent and wonderfully gold, on an empty spot by the well, and he set it on that spot so that whoever desired to drink water could drink by means of that goblet, and for however long it was there, no one dared to take that goblet.
Another relates how a traveling merchant reports to the Wallachian prince how, while staying at an inn, gold was stolen from his cart by night. Dracula tells him,
"Go this night, and you will find the gold." And he ordered that the whole city be searched for the thief, saying, "If the thief is not found, I will destroy the whole city." And Dracula ordered that his own gold be taken and placed in the merchant's cart in the night, and he added an extra piece of gold. And the merchant, having got up, found the gold, and having counted once, twice, he found the extra piece of gold, and having gone to Dracula and said, "My lord, I have found the gold, but this piece of gold is not mine. Is it extra?" Then they brought in the thief, and with him the gold. And Dracula said to the merchant, "Go in peace. If you had not told me about the gold, I would have been ready to impale you on a stake along with this thief."
So, aside from all the impaling and mutilating and boiling and flaying, he's not such a bad guy. Just likes to keep things on the up and up. So, now to the whole vampire thing. Is it really accurate to say that Bram Stoker based his Count Dracula on this historical figure? It is mentioned in the Beheim narrative that Vlad washed his hands in blood while picnicking among the impaled. There's certainly no mention of blood drinking. So the best we could do is imagine that this truly devilish personage, Vlad III, would be the type who might justifiably be cursed to live eternally, and that after death he might take up blood drinking. But is that what Stoker had in mind, actually? It doesn't seem so, unless he's being extremely coy in the matter. The name obviously was a direct borrowing. Notes Stoker made while writing Dracula contain a reference to a book that he used for background, the 1820 volume, An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson. In it, the name Dracula is interpreted as
"son of the devil."
It's that same folk etymology we've seen before, in which dragon is replaced with devil. But ironically, in this volume, there's no reference to Vlad III's bloodthirsty ways, his impaling or torturing of enemies. Had Stoker in some other way known these details, it's quite unlikely he would have omitted them. It's great detail for a horror story. But he does have his Dracula provide some autobiography that is a rather good match. In this speech, the Count speaks of his heritage, using Dracula more as a family name, meaning all his kin are, in a sense, sons of the devil, rather than he, Dracula, Vlad III, is the son of Vlad Dracul. In any case, the history is mostly a match here.
Who was it but one of my own race, who, as voivode, crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own ground? This was a Dracula indeed. Woe was it that his own unworthy brother, when he had fallen, sold his people to the Turk and brought the shame of slavery upon them.
Sounds like Vlad's brother Radu. However, beating the Turk on his own ground sounds like Vlad himself crossing the Danube into Bulgaria, as we've heard described. But Stoker throws in other information that makes identification with Vlad III less convincing, particularly his association of the Count with Transylvania, a region hated by the Impaler. While it's made vividly clear that Harker travels through Transylvania to reach the Count's castle, The location named in the novel suggests it's far north of Wallachia and on the far eastern edge of Transylvania, or even in Moldavia. The Borgo Pass, where Harker's picked up by Dracula's coach, is actually on the border between Transylvania and Moldavia, so presuming the coach continued further eastward on the journey, the Count's castle would actually be in Moldavia. And as it turns out, there is a Castle Dracula nearby, but it's a themed hotel in the Moldavian town of Vatra Dornei, one exploiting the association with the Borgo Pass. But all of this is probably putting too fine a point in it. Stoker was known to have written a portion of the book before he ever read William Wilkinson's history, before he found the name Dracula, that is. In earlier drafts, the character was simply named Count Vampyr, Wampyr, which probably didn't sound as goofy as it does now, since the word vampire or vampire was still rather exotic and foreign at the time. Also, final point, Stoker was a fiction writer, and again, that thing with the poetic license.
Yes, Virginia, there really was a Dracula. In Search of Dracula, the startling bestseller the nation couldn't put down becomes the motion picture you'll never get out of your mind.
This is the trailer for the 1975 documentary about, or largely about, Vlad Tepes and vampires, as described in Stoker's novel, also in Romanian lore, and even a bit of abnormal psychology. And it features a cape-wearing Christopher Lee as narrator. It's based on the 1972 book
In Search of Dracula,
a volume written by two Boston University professors, the Romanian émigré Radu Florescu and Raymond T. McNally, a scholar of Russian and Eastern European history. The book was a bestseller, translated into 15 languages, and was what brought the personage of Vlad the Impaler to popular attention, particularly as a prototype for Stoker's character. They also put Bram Castle on the map, making it Eastern Europe's #1 tourist destination. I've not read this book. For this show, I relied mainly on the work of Romanian historian and would-be collaborator on the 1972 book, that is, Matei Kazaku. Unfortunately, at the time, communist authorities banned such collaborations between a Romanian and an expat living in the U.S., so Kazaku's research was only later collected and issued an English translation in 2017 entitled simply Dracula. With this disclaimer, I would offer this one final thought, a last purely intuitive speculation regarding Florescu and McNally's book. I am guessing they got a little carried away or a little seduced by fame and royalties. In support of this, I present the titles of their follow-up books.
In Search of Frankenstein
by Florescu in 1975.
In Search of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde
by McNally in 2000.
In Search of the Pied Piper
by Florescu in 2005. I mean, what are the chances? They're all based on historical characters. Who am I to talk? I'm probably just jealous. After all, they had Christopher Lee on their side.
Just a word, ladies and gentlemen, a word of reassurance. When you go to bed tonight and the lights have all been turned out and you're afraid to look behind the curtain and you dread to see the face appearing at the window, just remember, there are such things.